Hi, and welcome to episode 33 of the Well Bible Reading Journey podcast. I'm so glad that you're joining us today. This week, we're going to be in Numbers chapters 4, 5, and 6 out of the Old Testament, Psalm 32, also out of the Old Testament, and Mark chapter 4 in the New Testament. In the New Testament, we're working our way through the Gospel of Mark, and it's an awesome gospel. I hope that you're following along with us, and I pray that God is blessing you as you do that. So we want to dive right in. We've got a lot to cover today. So I want to call in Amber and Craig. Come on and join me. Thanks for being here.
Hey, welcome back, Pastor.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I love what you guys did last week with Bobby and the week before together. It was totally awesome. I really enjoyed the podcast. Thanks for covering and thanks for giving me that little bit of a break as I spent some time with my family. But yeah, we're here and starting in Numbers. We jumped actually Genesis, Exodus. We skipped Leviticus. We're going to come back to it, but we're in Numbers. And it's turned out to be pretty fascinating. You don't expect these are the ones that usually slow you down, but we've got some really great stuff here. So let's talk about Numbers chapters 4, 5, and 6. A lot there. Where do you want to start? Numbers chapter 4, or just maybe an overview of what all this is?
I'll start with Numbers 4, just talking about some of what we're getting into and where it's starting. But we're still dealing with the holiness of the Lord and how the people live a purified life within Him. And so this is about breaking down the tabernacle. We've had Israel get counted, get organized, how to set up the tabernacle, how to arrange themselves around the tabernacle. We saw last week that forms a cross when they space themselves around the tabernacle appropriately.
Hmm.
And now we're going to deal with how God wants them to break down the tabernacle.
Yeah,
Every aspect of life has to be ordered in God.
that's a recurring theme here, and it's going to be a recurring theme throughout Numbers and in this section of the Scripture. And really, it's a recurring thing all the way back to Genesis. Is order, the idea of order, harmony, and purity. And so we see
Mhm.
all three coming out here in all three of these chapters, Numbers 4, 5, and 6. It starts with the census of the Levitical family. There are different clans within the tribe of the Levites. So it kind of takes the three major clans, gives them all the duties. But it's just really interesting how much detail it goes into, how important this idea of order is. I mean,
Yeah.
very, very specific. Uh, it continues to play on the idea of the temple being very mobile, being able to take it down and all that, way to do that, and also ties, of course, to the morality and the sacred nature of the temple itself. That's where Numbers 4 starts, and it really continues through 5 and 6 as well, doesn't it?
Yeah. I thought it was interesting that before they could do anything, that Aaron and his sons had to go in and cover everything up. And because that's like, yes, you've given this group of Levites the responsibility to carry these things, but they still had to be covered first because they were so holy, and the Levites were closer in the dwelling place than any of the other tribes, but they still were not as holy and could not do the things and touch the things of the tabernacle. So that was really interesting. They had to all be covered.
Yeah, and if they
Those
did, they would.
those coverings were the translation that we see as badger skins, but the actual Hebrew is closer to sea cow, which meant it was a waterproof skin that provided the covering around the holy implements and kept water, which represented chaos and disorder in the Middle Eastern mindset. So it kept the things of God in their proper place and protected from the chaos.
Yeah, that's interesting. It also would have been a lot more difficult for them to get that skin because they were not
Yeah.
seafaring people and they were not anywhere close to necessarily a sea. So that's super interesting. Um,
I also thought it was interesting that the age requirement was 30. It had like
mm,
an age requirement. And I was like, that's when Jesus started. I was trying to think of
mhm.
all the things that started at 30. And there's a sort of this idea of how important it is that there's no even a chance for them to have any youthful or childlike, that the gravity of what they're doing, you have to be at a certain age to do that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a great call out because you're looking at ages 30 to 50, which is the beginning of this idea of a man is wise in life at age of 30, but he
Mhm.
still has enough strength to
Right.
do these physical, laborious activities of breaking down the tabernacle and carrying the elements where they need to be. But then 50, kind of the retirement age where the strength is going to kind of start to wane. And not that you're super old at 50, but it's time for retirement.
no, in that day and age, you were. It was the I think life expectancy was something like 42.
Yeah, you're right.
So 30, you were already middle aged at 30, and so there's no doubt about that. That's a good call. Um, And also the way here, again, emphasizing order, harmony, purity, keeping the temple pure, separating the distinctive responsibilities between the Levites and the priests, and so kind of trying to delineate that. But this idea of confession, repentance, and restitution. So there was this process for overcoming the sins and the different things it's talking about, and it involved confession, which is admitting it, but also repentance, which means turning and going a different direction, and then also restitution, super important there. Did you guys get anything from that?
So the aspect of that I've that I caught onto was the physical manifestations of the spiritual state. So we get folks with lepers or boils on their skins or imperfections on the skins, as well as those with discharges that represent certain spiritual sins, and these are represented in Leviticus when we go through there. And as you're reading through the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, in order, you'll get this foundation by the time you get to Exodus. But here, take our word for it that these are covered in Leviticus. For example, exclusion of the lepers and around them are in Leviticus 13 through 14. So the point is that there's imperfection in the presence of God in the tabernacle, which to Amber's earlier points in previous podcasts, the tabernacle is Eden, and we're in the presence of God. It's the recreation of heaven on earth. And so when there's these imperfections, when there's this impurity, it has to be expelled from the camp. But then and when we're talking about lepers and people discharged, there's also regulations, there's procedures for them to come back into the camp and be restored, to your point, Ellison. That's where you're getting to the restitution part. But in the
Yeah.
middle of that, there's the confession that's so important for the recognition of sin, for the recognition of impurity, and for the chance for the human heart to be opened up to restitution. Because we've seen in various aspects of the narrative up to this point, Pharaoh comes to mind mostly, but Jesus called out the hardness of the Pharisees' heart at the end of chapter 3 and Mark 3 last week. And he's talking about this hardness of the heart that are in blaspheming of the Holy Spirit, where if you're not open to the things of God, if you don't have ears to hear, as Jesus is constantly admonishing during Mark, if you're closing yourself off and you're closing your heart off, that's you doing that, right? That's you cutting yourself off from the oxygen of life, from God, who is the source of life, and leading yourself down the road of spiritual death. So, we talked a bit about how God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and we also talked about how God quickened a process towards the end of the 10 plagues process that was already in motion because of Pharaoh and his own attitude, and he was trying to set himself up as God. So it's never
Right.
God that is hardening the heart to begin with. It's always starting with what we've done to close ourselves off.
Yeah, and here he gives a way back, right? And so you see a lot of parallels here between, as we mentioned before, I think the temple representing the kind of the Garden of Eden, Genesis, the Genesis narrative. So Amber, you picked up on a lot of these kind of analogies. Talk to us about that, the analogies to what happened in the garden, what's happening here with the temple now. It's almost a new garden experience.
Yeah, exactly right, Ellis. Thank you. I remember when I was first reading these, I was like, these seem really out of place. They seem like the author just plucked 3 or 4 of these random laws, because we know there's a lot of them, and placed them here, probably in a really specific order. And so my brain's trying to figure out patterns. That's how my brain works now. If you've been watching this podcast, you know that's how my brain works.
Yeah.
Since Genesis 1 through 9, we started this pattern. And I'm just going to remind us this pattern that we've seen since Genesis 1 through 9, we've seen it over and over again. It is this pattern of creation. And then we have a failure that leads to some sort of chaos. And then you have decreation of some sort. And then you have a remnant, like a righteous remnant that is left. And then from there, either a new creation or a new covenant arises, and then we start the pattern over. And so Genesis 1 through 9 is the first of these, and then we just repeat it over and over. And so what dawned on me this week, as I was less trying to figure out what each law meant and more being like, why is this here? And what am I supposed to learn from it? What we just experienced in last week's podcast and last week's reading is we get these notes and this image of creation, of Genesis. You have a group of people who are near God, near the tabernacle. They're grouped around them in a special way. You have the Levites, who the closest of all. So the tabernacle is the holy place, is the tree of life, is the tabernacle, not just the garden, but actually the tree of life. And then you have the Levites that kind of represent Adam and Eve. They're the closest to them. And then you have all the other tribes that represents the fruitful trees of the garden, because they've been fruitful and multiplied. You get this image of all these numbers, right?
Mhm.
So we're getting all this Eden language. And so I'm like, okay, why are these here? Well, if we continue the pattern, the next thing in line is the fall. So when I read this first part about the unclean people, it specifically, you could pay attention to these few sentences. It makes a point to talk about how they get sent out of the camp. They have to be sent out of the camp. That's what happens with Adam and Eve. They
Mhm.
have to be exiled out of the garden, and now they're just part of Eden. But you see here, God has given a way to come back in. They can get ritually clean again, and they get to be invited back in.
Mhm.
And so this is kind of an undoing of Eden, if you will. And then
Mhm.
you get this in the next story. The next story, you have this idea of restitution. But what's happening here is we read this in the Leviticus, the same set of law, but read it in Leviticus. It's talking specifically about brother on brother. So it's when one Israelite does wrong to its brother, where there you have Cain and Abel story.
Mhm.
And Cain and Abel, one brother wrongs the other brother and kills him, and there's no restitution. There's no repentance at all. So God is saying, when one Israelite wrongs another, here's what you're supposed to do. Here's the undoing of Cain and Abel.
Mhm.
The next story in the Genesis 1 through 9 pattern, we're continuing, is the Noah story. Is they've become so wicked that God had to do away. This is the deconstruction part, decreation part. And then that is the next story, which we will talk about more, I hope. But it's the adultery story. This is about a woman who has to drink a type of bitter water that is called a curse. Well, God himself calls the flood a curse at the end of the flood. And so
Mhm.
you have this image of God, this water, bitter water, being flooded through the woman. And if she is righteous and if she is faithful, she can continue having babies. And
Mhm.
if she is unfaithful, then it's a curse, right?
Right.
And you're supposed to have this image that if she is faithful to the covenant, then she can continue having these children, which will lead to a Israelite man or woman who can have the Nazarite vow. And so this
Mhm.
continues. The Nazarite vow is that remnant, is that righteous remnant, and then you have the Aaron's blessing, which will start the pattern all over again. So
Yeah.
this is why they're here. They're for a pattern. So look at this pattern as you read this week.
Very good. Very excellent. That's
Mhm.
right on target. The Nazarite vow itself, with the nothing from the vine, no fermented drink, no cutting of the hair, no contact with corpse or death or anything like that. So it's really addressing all these things that have been destructive
That's right.
to the Israelites. After you mentioned Noah, and after he comes out of that, what does he do? He gets drunk, right? And
That's right. First
bad
thing he
things
does.
start to happen. So
Mhm.
it really is an interesting pattern. Thank you for bringing that out.
Welcome.
You mentioned the woman with adultery. It's
Mm,
actually a process for dealing with a husband's suspicion of a woman
yes.
committing adultery. We don't know that she's committed adultery. No one does, but he suspects it. Or so it's an interesting scene, because you could take this really wrong. I mean, for modern eyes, modern ears, listening to this sounds awful. They take the woman, they're going to test her. It's called trial by ordeal. She has to go through this ordeal to prove herself pure and righteous, and not having committed adultery, all because a man just suspects. He may just be paranoid.
Yeah.
But I think what it's really, if you look at the heart of that story, that what's happening here is that the scripture is saying that jealousy and suspicion and secrets in the community kill the community. They're toxic
Exactly.
to the community. So you have to deal with the jealousy and the secrets and the suspicious or paranoia. You have to deal with that by seeking truth, right? And so the way they're going to do that, and actually, it actually is almost, this is really saying we need to be fair, because this was a patriarchal society, and the husband ruled. He was the man of the house. She was to submit to him and all that. Women were considered a little more like property than anything else. And so it's not fair for you to be punishing her just because of your suspicion, right?
Right.
So here is a fair way, and it goes through the whole ritual that they have to do. But mixing pure water, holy water, sacred water with sacred dust off the floor of the temple,
Mhm.
so it's sacred.
Yeah.
And so this whole idea of the sacred nature of the concoction, she drinks it. If she swells up, and actually the thigh falling off of her is a euphemism probably for having a miscarriage or not able to have children. To Amber's point earlier, if she's righteous, then she doesn't miscarry, and if she's not, then it shows. But it really is fair. And in the drink they make her take water mixed with dust in and of itself isn't going to cause any woman to swell up. It's not going to do that. So this was actually kind of a way of, let's let God show us. Let's listen to God on this, not listen to the man who's suspicious, but the man who's suspicious needs to listen to God. And this is the way God is going to tell us or speak to us. It really created this, I know it sounds odd, but a fair system for the woman as much as for the
Mhm.
community, right?
Yes,
Yeah, I was
like
thinking.
that.
Go
Yeah.
ahead, Ella.
Just
Go
real,
ahead, Greg.
just yeah, just real quick, Amber, and back to you. But just real, any guy who we who he's any guy who's jealous can easily fly off the handle. Is my point. So this provides an outlet for that and a channel for that to be dealt with.
Yeah. Yeah. Good.
Yeah, I was gonna say this kind of the same thing is like we get so focused on the weirdness of what's happening. Like to us, this is why would you ever treat anyone this way? We get so caught up in the what's happening that we forget the whole point of this was to deal with the spirit of jealousy. In that between a man and a woman, between a marriage, between community, that spirit of jealousy has to be reckoned with. It has
Mhm.
to be reckoned with. And interesting side thought, I didn't think till just now that it specifically used the word spirit of jealousy, which is the word for wind, which is exactly what Noah, this the spirit is part of the Noah story again. So I just doing a little Amber star. Another
Yeah,
another one. Yeah,
it's
like
also part of the creation story, right?
it
The
is. It
spirit
is.
hovering over the waters. So
Exactly.
you have
Mhm.
from chaos, order and creation, and
Mhm.
then fall and
Yeah.
chaos again. So to your point,
Exactly. So I was
yeah.
like, "Oh yeah, there's another one." But I wrote a point that right after this, it talks about that he shall pour is okay. She should have do a remembrance offering, and I thought that's odd. I mean, if she's doing her, she remembers. I mean, if she did the act, she doesn't need to take an offering to remember. So what's the point of the remembrance offering? And I made a note that says not that she has forgotten, but rather the whole community has to remember the terrible nature of either adultery act or false accusation.
Mm,
Both of them have to be dealt with,
mm,
whether that be the nature of the adultery itself or the nature of this false accusation. This is the this offering was actually for the whole community to have a remembrance of
yeah.
what happens when you have these issues in our community.
Yeah, no, that's good. And in fact, it just made me think that with the temple, the symbolism here, they're trying to build, God is building a new Eden, so to speak,
Hmm.
but it's an Eden, unlike the original Eden, that has to deal with sin, that the sin is
Yeah.
still there and people are still going to sin. So how do you live together in a community in this idyllic Eden kind of state? Well, you deal with the sin. You don't pretend it's not there. You don't sweep it under the rug. You don't look the other way. You deal with your problems, with your relationships, with your struggles, and with your sin. So that's excellent. It's not easy to do, but it was super important to them. Uh,
We're finally to the point where we talked about in Genesis where God was either trying to get a relationship of perfection and life of perfection with humans and humans living in a righteous life in Him, and mostly with through Adam and Eve. But then he dealt with that failure through complete destruction. Then after the flood, he said, "Okay, I'm hanging up my rainbow or my bow, my armaments and of war. I'm going to point them towards myself and not destroy the earth anymore. I'm disarming myself." And he's trying to find that way of life with humans to thread that needle between those two ways of complete acceptance and righteousness versus complete destruction and non-acceptance, I guess, and trying to find a way. We have to acknowledge life in a holy God, but in a pure way, but also acknowledging that humans are sinful, and this is a way he's doing that in the that we're seeing here.
Very good. Very good.
I have one more thing. I was joking with Austin this week reading about the Nazarite vow. I said, "Well, I really don't like grapes. I don't drink wine. My hair, I haven't touched my hair in a long time. It's very long. I haven't touched any dead bodies in a while. I guess I won't be cutting my leg hairs anytime soon." And Austin's like, "Nope, you're out. You're out.
Yeah,
No, you're out."
you're not no Nazarite vows.
That's right.
Yeah.
No, no vow for me. But what's interesting is like, I guess I didn't realize that this process of coming out of the vow, this process that they're allowed to enter in, and they're allowed to enter out at any time.
Yeah.
And but the process to do that it's actually 7 ritual things that they had steps they had to do to get out, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah,
Course
yeah.
sevens.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
what he's doing here in Numbers actually is opening that Nazirite vow up, because the original Nazirite vow was from birth. It was a child. It was a child, usually male, specifically devoted to God from birth. So you have Samson in this case with him. It's probably a bad example because it didn't end well for him. But Samson was a Nazirite vow. Samuel, same thing, right?
Mhm.
You have that same idea there. But here he's saying anyone can
Mhm.
can do this of your own volition. The Apostle Paul takes a Nazarite vow in the Book of Acts when he comes back to Jerusalem the last time, and he's trying to convince the Jews that he's not against them. He takes a Nazarite vow. So you see that happening. That's right. You see that peppered throughout there.
So before we leave the number 6, I want to cover real quick on the Nazarite vow, the 3 signs of separation, which you mentioned, Ellis, the
Mhm,
forbidding of any drink from the vine, the fruit of the vine, and it's not just wine; it's also grape juice, essentially.
mhm.
But also the hair, the long hair, and then they can't touch a dead body or be aware around a dead body. So why those? So there's signs here that lead us back to the righteous remnant. To your part, Amber, to your point, Amber, that shows the recreation and the restoration of relationship of humanity with God through the righteous remnant, and that that is in the sense that the drink is so that the Lord will be their only true vine, their only true source of influence. God doesn't want any competition from other vines, from
Mm.
uh, other firmamented drinks that could compete for their interest and their ways of making them feel good or feel
Yeah.
justified in life. The hair signifies awareness in the Bible, right? The hairy goat was given as a sin offering to bring awareness or represent awareness of sin. And then lastly, the Nazarite not being around a dead body, they couldn't pollute themselves. Dead bodies were polluted, were not they were not clean in the Middle Eastern society, and so if they were around impurity, the Nazarite vow was, they couldn't be separated to God anymore. So these 3 signs of separation call back to the pristine state of humanity with God in the Garden of Eden. The source of knowledge of good and evil that was kept away from humanity. There was no awareness of wrongdoing, and there was no death.
Mm, yeah, that's really really good. Where he talks about the vine and the fermented drink, and it's not that drinking is wrong. This is a special vow. Not everyone takes, but it's not that it's wrong. It's this idea of actually using the fermented drink to replace that which God is to do for you. So you get drunk. The Bible does talk negatively about getting drunk. It doesn't talk negatively about wine, but it talks negatively about getting drunk because you are taking the fermented uh, fruit of the vine and you're taking it to feel good instead of going to God to feel good, right? And to anesthetize your pain. So yeah, it's very interesting how all that plays together. Okay, so that's Numbers, and there's a lot there. Where we've got Psalm 32. We're not going to really get into because we don't have time, but we have Mark chapter 4, right?
Yeah.
Big chapter, also a lot of parables, mostly filled with parables. The very first one is the parable of the sower, which is considered to be really the template for all other parables. It's one of the few parables in the Gospels. It's in all 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it is one of the few parables that Jesus actually explains, or his explanation is recorded. We're told that he explained the parables to his disciples, but this time the explanation is recorded in the gospel. And so that makes it a very important parable, the parable of the sower. But then you have the other parables that follow. So what kind of popped out at you from Mark chapter 4?
Yeah, I'll start real quick. I want to start with a quote from a book I quoted when or introduced when we first went into Mark by Richard Burridge, Four Gospels, One Jesus. Quick quote that kind of encapsulated what's going on here. If we are using biography as a key to understanding the Gospels, it makes more sense to see the disciples' incomprehension in Mark as telling us more about his portrait of Jesus than about the disciples themselves. He is someone whom people find hard to understand and tough to follow. So perhaps the audience can take comfort in that they find discipleship difficult. The lion roars and rushes on ahead. At the very end of the Narnia stories, Aslan leads them all in a headlong chase into his country. Come farther in, come farther up, he shouted over his shoulder. But who could keep up at him with that pace? So Mark's account suggests that disciples of every age will struggle to follow this lion, but he promises to meet us in Galilee, where he first called us and chose us to be in his pride and to be his pride and joy. So that's just acknowledging the fact that these are tough things that Jesus is teaching. But
Mhm.
when we go down to verse 22 of Mark, he says that the things that are being taught are to be disclosed. I'm teaching these things to be disclosed, and don't take the light and keep it under the basket. Is to you that is the apostles and now us as disciples are to be that light.
Yeah, that's one of the parables. Yeah, the parables are hard, and it seems like Jesus is doing that on purpose for several reasons. One is that he wants discipleship means working at it, right? So he's not going to just spoon feed it to you in real, he's giving it to them in ways that they have to think about it. Parables are not easy. This is the way the rabbis would teach, by the way. Sometimes they would use riddles, which are even harder. But what the reason they use those is because they want you to work at it. If you work at it, you can get the treasure is inside the parable, but you've got to work to get it. And Jesus, in various times, and after the parable, he tells a parable. He says, "Those who have ears to hear, eyes to see, you're going to get it. But if you don't, you're not." Right. So you see that going on. Jesus using the parables. Mark here says Jesus never taught without using parables. He did it all the time, but that he would explain to his disciples, right, later at home. He didn't explain to everybody. He explained to his disciples because, to your point, they were going to disclose what these meant. So it was important that they understood. But the fact that he had even explained to his disciples means these were not easy to get, right?
Yeah, that should be encouraging to us as we read it and we read through it and we're like, huh? That should
Yeah,
be encouraging that even the disciples are like, help me out here, Jesus. And
yeah.
that's just intentional. If you read Jesus's words and you're like, I'm not understanding, you're not alone.
Hmm.
And it was probably intentional for lots of reasons. One, if at the very beginning of last week's reading, it even says that based on what he was doing, that they started to plot against him and how to destroy him. And
Hmm.
Jesus knows if he's going to speak in a way, he's almost revealing people's hearts by the way that they can or cannot understand, or their willingness to dig, or their willingness to ask what's going on here. The Pharisees, we know that they are the center of a lot of these parables. We're going to, especially as we get closer to Jerusalem,
Hmm.
um, you know, they can't hear, they don't understand, they don't have ears to hear, and it's almost as if his parables are almost calling out those who are rebellious against him.
Yeah, it is. Some of the things that are happening there, we know that Jesus is being persecuted. We know at a certain point, Jesus can no longer go into a village or a city because they're after him. And it's interesting that, this has been studied that societies that are under oppression, that are being persecuted, people groups that are being persecuted, they develop their own coded language to really talk about the oppressor without the oppressor getting it. Right? It's almost like using Pig Latin or whatever. You're using your own language, and they develop words and languages. The slaves did this during the antebellum period with the antebellum preaching. They would preach in ways that the master wouldn't get it because they knew the master was always listening. So they used their own kind of coded language to talk about things they didn't want the master hearing, right? So Jesus may be doing some of this, and then also just asking his own disciples to dig for it. There's a scene, this same scene actually described in the Gospel of Luke, I believe it is, where Jesus tells the parable of the sower, and then he goes home, and the disciples follow him home, and the disciples come say, "Hey, explain it to us. We didn't get it, right?"
Yeah.
And I can't help but think that actually anybody who wanted to could have come to ask him for an explanation, but he says literally, okay, he says, okay, you didn't get it. He says, to you I will explain, not to the rest. Right. And that seems kind of cruel. Or like, Jesus, don't you want everyone to get it? And the answer kind of is no, I want the ones who want it to get it. You have to want it. Right.
It's like the mental image I get is the students who really want to understand the subject are going to line up at the professor's door either after class or for open office hours.
Right. Yeah. Oh, I hated those students because
Yeah,
they were the ones who got the A's, right?
right.
Because they're saying I can't go eat lunch until I understand your lecture. I didn't get this part of the lecture. I've got to understand this, right? And that, by the way, was maybe what 10%, 20% of the class. Most of the class was headed to lunch. They didn't care, right? They didn't care. So yeah, that's what you see going on here with a lot of these parables. Was there a parable or a scene out of the Gospel of Mark that just kind of jumped out at you and you really want to kind of go a little deeper in? Because there's a number of great parables here.
Yeah, I thought the last scene was interesting when they're in the boat and the storm wails up and threatens to capsize the boat, and Jesus is sleeping and the disciples are scared, and
Mhm.
basically chastises their lack of faith. So after all of his teaching and the parables and his explanations, and it's hard to understand, but he's going to get, in a sense, give them the key to understanding. They're still struggling with faith and to understand who he is and why he's there.
Yeah. There is this sense in which even the ones that he's explaining to still struggle with faith, right? Yeah. Amber, did you get something out of that? The whole
Yes.
calming the storm scene?
Yeah, actually, this is one of my very favorite passages in the Gospels, actually. And
Okay.
I don't think 4 minutes is going to give me enough time, but I'll do to really get through it. Why I love it so much. This is so much here.
Yeah.
First of all, this passage is very abused and misunderstood passage.
Mhm.
I am trying not to I'm trying not to step on anyone's toes when I want to tell you that this is not about the storm. Like Jesus is going to keep you calm in the storms of your life. This is I'm not saying that can't be
Well,
applied. I'm just
sure.
saying
Yeah,
that
sure.
is not the main purpose. And when we focus on that, we miss the great theological moment this is. This is a huge, huge, huge moment for the
Mhm.
disciples. I mean, it's like an eye-opening moment to the disciples when Jesus is asleep and they're like, "Oh my gosh, we're going to die." And they're waking up Jesus like, "Do you not even care? Do you not
Mm.
even care? We're about to die." And he basically hushes the storm and he rebukes the wind. And it says that Jesus is like, "Why are you afraid?" And then after he did that, it says they are even more afraid. They're even more terrified than they were when they're about to die because they're like, "Who is this guy? Who
Right.
is this man?" Guys, this is a huge moment because they knew he was the Messiah. They knew they've seen the miracles. They've seen miracles. They've seen him cast demons, and now they've seen him rebuke the wind and calm the sea. In a Jewish mind, only God can do those things.
Hmm.
Only God Himself can do those things. Their entire Jewish culture has psalm. I mean, I went to the Psalms. I found like 6 in like 2 minutes,
Mm.
and all through the Old Testament of like God is the only one who can control the weather, who can
Mm.
calm the seas. Remember, their salvation moment as a people group is the Red Sea moment when he controlled the sea and he
Mhm.
destroyed their enemy because of his ability to move the sea and calm the winds. So, anyways, this moment is their moment of salvation. Only God. And so when Jesus does this, it's like, oh my God, he's not just Messiah, he is God. And
Mhm.
that's
Yeah.
why they're more terrified. In fact, this phrase here, I did some Greek this week and not some Hebrew, first
Mhm.
time. In the Greek, the first time it talks about the way that they were afraid. The first one means to be cowardly, to be fearful or lack courage. That's when they were afraid of about to die.
Mhm.
Which makes sense. They're being
Sure.
cowardly, they're lacking courage, they're going to die. Oh my gosh. The
Sure.
second time it says that they were even more afraid, that word actually carries a connotation of intimidation or reverence. So it's
Mhm.
a different kind of fear altogether, and it is greater than.
Yeah.
Guys, this is a huge moment. This is not about, oh my gosh, when I have terrible storms in my life, if I just, Jesus is going to
Yeah.
give me peace. This is not this. This is their
Right.
aha moment that this is both Messiah, Son of Man, which God calls himself, but he's really the Son of God. And
Yes.
it's like he's both things, and this is their moment to understand that. This is a huge
Absolutely.
moment.
It is. And Mark, throughout the whole thing, Mark has been working hard to establish Jesus' authority, his
Correct.
authority and who he is. You saw the baptism and the heavens open up.
Mhm.
And now you see this, and you're absolutely right. The storm, the waves, the sea was all representative to your point, Amber, earlier about chaos. All representative of chaos, evil. The evil dwelled in the depths of the sea and all that. And for Jesus to have power even over that meant he had power in their minds. He had power over evil. He had power
Right.
over the demons. He had power over the chaos. He had power over all that, and that was equated only to God. And so this is absolutely, you're right. The primary point of this moment is to establish firmly who Jesus is. And this one, more than maybe any other, a miracle, to your point, Amber, really establishes that. It was a big moment for the disciples. They're going to still struggle with his divinity. They're going to
Mhm.
still struggle with it, but
Yep.
this is that moment where they catch it. Hey guys, thanks. This has been an awesome time. Guys, listening to us, I pray that God will bless you. There's so much there to dig into in Mark chapter 4. I hope that you can glean everything you can out of these parables. I pray that God will bless you. Ask God to speak to you, and He will speak straight to your heart. So God bless you until we see you again.
Bye.